quite a bit, and he also figures in her story. So these are the gardens. Mona designed, laid them out. These, I just put these in here, how little they changed between 1938 when the house was built and 1998 when I was there with Robbins Elliott and took some of these photographs. I also thought it was interesting that often where I stood to take the photographs, I found out later, because these pictures didn't come to light until about 2 years later, I found out that I was standing in pretty much in the same spot that she had been when she took the picture. So that was the back, the terrace, having tea with her in-laws. And that's how it looked in 1998. It actually enclosed the terrace. And that little, one of those little windows up there is the former servants' quarters in the attic. And I took a picture of the front door, again, not knowing until later that that was the front door that when the Gestapo arrived and interrogated her in her own home, that was the last view she would have had of her front door, and that was the first I had of it. Now this is the space in the master bedroom. This door, it's rather misleading because these are two separate pictures. So if you opened the door to the closet there, you would see this row of shoes. But behind it is another door which opens into this little attic space. Not ventilated, not a good place for somebody to stay for a very long time, but it served the purpose. Because when Mona and Willem were hiding Allied airmen, sometimes they were only in the house for a matter of hours. Sometimes they were there long enough for a cup of tea, because the idea was to keep people moving. You know, a lot of the people, and the network that they belonged to, there were farmers, there were teachers, there were business people. So it was a very diverse group. So obviously, if they were flying back over from a bombing mission, they would, you know, the farmers were usually the first ones to see them go down. They'd run out, get them out of the vehicle, get them out of the plane if they were still alive, and put them wherever they could, as fast as they could, because they knew that the Nazis would be in very quickly. So their place was close to the city. It wasn't in Amsterdam. As I said, it was in Laren, which was about a 45-minute drive at that time. But they had a big enough estate that they could take people in and, you know, give them a place, give them refuge, while they were waiting for things like false identity papers, civilian clothing, which, by the way, was a violation of the Geneva Convention, and they could have been shot for that, and to give them the papers that they needed to make the arrangement to get them out of occupied Holland. So this was a small space. The attic space that I mentioned before is, now this is half of it. So you're looking at this, that's where one bed was, and you turn around and there's a space equally big on the other side where there was another sleeping quarters. But just outside that room was a three-piece bathroom. So when you think that a lot of the stories told by Allied airmen who were rescued in occupied Holland, we're talking about having to be put in haymos, attics, cellars. These guys were staying at the Ritz-Carlton by comparison, right? Now, this is the other side of the entrance hall. I love this. I'm sure that must be a Gainsborough on the wall. This home was owned by Baron and Baroness van Heekeren, who were very gracious to allow me access and to take photographs of their home. But imagine, you know, getting the knock on the door one evening. Now, they had been warned. Mona, they heard that certain members of their network had been taken in, questioned, and released. And very often this was a tactic. Sometimes it was just a fishing expedition on the part of the Gestapo. They didn't really know, but they kind of had an idea. And so they would go in and they would take people randomly, and that would sort of put a ripple out in the rest of the organization. And people would either cease activities altogether, or they would simply curtail their activities in the hopes that that attention would go away. Now, Mona got home one day and was told by, actually I'm getting ahead of myself, there was a code that they would use, something as simple as they would phone the house, and if they would say something like, come for dinner on the 23rd, and by the way, remember to pick up your umbrella, you left it here the last time. Something as simple as that was a code to let them know that they had airmen for them to pick up. So Dirk Brouwer, that architect that I was mentioning to you, he had a lovely home, you'll see a picture in a few minutes, near the Vondelpark in Amsterdam. And so he invited them one evening to a dinner party where they met two English flyers, Richard Pape and Jacques Moyer. Jacques Moyer was the pilot, Pape was the navigator. Other members of their crew had been taken out by other people. This was, as I said, early in the days of the resistance. because when there was still a possibility to get out into the North Sea from ports like Leyden, out on fishing boats to meet British submarines who would then take the flyers back to England to fly another day. So they met Pape and Moyer, who had been given their clothes, their identity papers, and they had to go home. Now, there were several checkpoints between Amsterdam and Laren, but Mona and Willem passed between them frequently enough that they often knew the soldiers who were staffing the checkpoints. And you had to remember that the Nazis were terribly, terribly class conscious, right? If you had a certain station, and remember, there was no historical animosity between Germany and Holland. And after all, a lot of people were, had all the qualifications of being good gene pool for the master race, blonde-haired and blue-eyed. We don't want to annoy these people. We want them to be friends. So, especially among the upper class, there was a very strange kind of respect. So, one evening, when they go to Dirk Brouwer's home, meet these two airmen, and very late at night they have to drive home, and they have to pass through a checkpoint. So they said to Pape and Moyer, just pretend you're very drunk and asleep. We'll hand them your papers. There won't be a problem going through the checkpoint. And sure enough, they stopped. They exchanged pleasantries with the guard, and handed the papers and shone a light in the back. They've had a little bit too much to drink, and we're just going to let them go home to sleep it off. And they passed through, no problem. What they didn't know was that another member had been rounded up with his family, with his wife and children, and they had been held for 24 hours and let go. And then after they'd been free for a while, they then rounded up, I think it was Willem Lenglet. They picked him up again. And of course, word got back to Mona and Willem. They couldn't move Pape and Moyer. They ended up staying in Ingleside for an unprecedented 6 days. Now, instead of being out there for a couple of hours or overnight when you think you could just, nobody's really noticed they're gone, they had to stay there. Now, as I said, it was the Ritz-Carlton. They had radio, magazines, chocolate, whatever they wanted, and they could go for walks in the garden. If they needed to, they could hide in that little space behind the bedroom closet if anybody came in, but nobody did. And so when they left, when they finally, when Brouwer came to pick them up, and they left, they thought it had been successful. But still, we'll just let it lie low for a few days. We won't do anything. And when Moyer was talking to, I think it was MI5 after the war, and said when we left their house, this German staff car pulled up alongside us, slowed down, had a good look, and then passed us. But they didn't stop us, so we thought everything was fine. Now, it's key with this story. That's just the living room. Let you remember that too, because that's the room where Mona was first interrogated by the Gestapo and thought she'd actually pulled the wool over their eyes. I'm going to fast forward to, that's Dirk Brouwer's home. It's now, I think, 3 apartments. There's Richard Pape. And this man is pivotal because he made quite a reputation as an adventurer. He wrote his story. The closest he came, there was Boldness Be My Friend, and Sequel to Boldness. Now, Boldness Be My Friend, he mentioned Mona Parsons. In Sequel to Boldness, he actually devoted a chapter to Mona Parsons. And he talks about her in a very style, very typical of the period, that, rather stiff upper lip kind of thing, but she must have come out of the war with something other than a cramp in her very stiff upper lip. But he downplayed it, and it wasn't really Mona's voice. In fact, she wrote to a cousin after the book came out and said he described it rather brashly, I thought, my contribution to the war. But what Pape neglected to tell in his biography, and which I found out later at the Netherlands Institute for War Documentation, was that after they left the home, when they were leaving, Mona went to him and gave him her calling card and said, I have a friend from Nova Scotia who's living in London. When you get back, give her my card because I haven't been able to let my father know. We've been able to send postcards, but my letters are sent back by the Nazis. Please let them know that I am truly okay and that you've seen me and I'm doing what I can for the war effort. Pape said great, stuffed it in his pocket, and Virginia Tufts Pickett's last name and number were on the back of it. Stuffed it in his pocket. And of course he had his code book because, he was a navigator. When they were actually apprehended near Leyden, he tells this very dramatic story about we didn't realize, we knew something was wrong, and that the people who'd taken us in were actually betraying us. And when they came hammering on the door, I ran to the bathroom and I ripped up my code book and I was flushing pieces down the toilet, and things that weren't going down I was picking out of the toilet and eating so they wouldn't get this information. Except he forgot about the note in his pocket, the card in his pocket. So they had Mona implicated already. They didn't even have Willem. Now, by this point, Mona and Willem had been notified that people had been picked up. They had to be quiet for a while, but they said maybe it would be a good idea to just go off maybe to Friesland or somewhere away, lie low for a while. Willem did. He left. She stayed with the dogs and said, if the Nazis come calling, I'm an actor. I can act the part. I'll just tell them that, you've gone fishing in Friesland for a few days and everything will be fine. Well, she had a problem with her tooth and she had to see a dentist, and she went off and did some shopping, and De Boer took her, drove her home that afternoon, and in the bushes outside the front door of Ingleside is Dirk Brouwer saying, I have it on good authority that they are now picking up a whole bunch of people. They're not catching and releasing. They're actually systematically going through, you need to leave. And she said, I'm not going to leave, I'm going to be fine. Well, the housekeeper who'd been there was freaking out because she said they'd been here 3 times already. They said they're coming back at 5 o'clock. Dirk Brouwer tried to convince her to go. She said, no, you go do what you have to do. I'm staying home. I'm staying with my dogs. I'm staying with my house. I will not let the Nazis drive me out. Well, he left. It was the last time she ever saw him. The Gestapo arrived, because